Welcome to Ampersand, a new podcast series from Penn Arts and Sciences, where faculty from different disciplines discuss a topic they have in common. As part of this series, we're bringing you conversations with the new Dean of Arts and Sciences, Mark Trodden, who will be speaking with faculty from a range of disciplines about their research and topical issues in their fields of study. In this episode, Dean Trodden speaks with Rebecca Waller, Associate Professor of Psychology, about her research on child development, antisocial behavior, and the ways scientific tools are transforming psychology and reshaping how we understand parenting, well-being, and education.
So welcome, Becky. It's great to be speaking with you and to see you again. We are both, of course, originally from the UK, so we have that in common. So it's the first time in this booth for me with another Brit. But we're also both scientists, but from very, very different disciplines. Certainly, my own work is extremely far from the kinds of things you do. So perhaps we can start the discussion by talking about how you got started as a psychologist and how you became interested in child development.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for having me. It's really nice to be here, and I'm looking forward to our discussion. Yeah, in terms of how I got started in psychology, I guess a kind of really sort of stereotypical answer would just be always. I was always interested in psychology, even when I didn't know that psychology was a subject to be studied. As a child, I read every single Agatha Christie book ever written before I was 10.
Me too.
Oh, you did? Okay. Oh, we have that in common too. Maybe that's just an inherent part of the British education. But I think it was, what that spoke to is kind of this real curiosity about why people do what they do, how personality develops, and how our behavior and our responses to things can be shaped by our experience. And for me, it was just a no-brainer that I would study psychology at university. And as you know, in the UK, it's a little different. You have to commit to your major before you start. And so that's what I did. And then while I was at Oxford as an undergraduate, I continued to just be really interested in individual differences. So again, the things that vary between people and how those differences come about, particularly in personality and psychopathology. And really at that time, it was quite general and focused on adults. But over time, including now through my career at Penn, I've just become more and more interested in the origins of those differences developmentally. So I didn't start by thinking I want to study child development, but because I was interested in psychopathology and personality, just naturally over time, I started to study younger and younger samples. And now even we have a cohort that we've been following since pregnancy. So, the youngest that you can really go. So, yeah, I think genuinely sort of just always the types of sort of curious questions I've had have had that sort of psychological lens to them.
Yeah, that's great. I always think when I speak to psychologists that it seems incredibly unmanageable what they do. It's a very messy, huge, complicated system. And, as someone who is a cosmologist, someone who studies the universe, I also study what is in principle a huge complex system, although of course we make many, many simplifying assumptions along the way. In cosmology, one thing we've seen in the last several decades is a huge increase in technology, and therefore, of course, the associated data that comes along with that. And it's really transformed the way we think about studying the universe. In your discipline in psychology, how has that changed in the same time frame? Are there new tools or approaches that have transformed how you personally conduct research now compared to how you learned about research when you were, for example, an undergraduate at Oxford?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, certainly thinking about as an undergrad, just because that's sort of top of mind. I remember, for example, reading some of the very first imaging studies, functional magnetic resonance imaging studies, where maybe a study of 10 people, and they would lie in a scanner and tap their finger, or be shown lights so that we could locate visual cortex. And just to think, even in I don't want to do the math of how long ago that was, but not many decades later, we are now doing imaging with tens of thousands of people, and the sort of sophistication of what we're able to measure in terms of brain structure, brain function, as well as physiology, and sort of combining different technologies. So whether that's imaging combined with physiology, combined with EEG, to really understand what's happening kind of at a biological level to underpin some of the behaviors and the traits that I'm interested in studying. So I think that's been huge and probably, similar to cosmology, I think we are just barely scratching the surface. We're still so early on in our understanding of the incredible capabilities of the human brain. So I think it's sort of exciting, but it's good to be humble about what we don't know, I think, and be thinking about how to use those methods really thoughtfully. And of course, it's evolving all the time. And I think probably similarly to the cosmology example you gave, I think there's just been huge advances in the sort of sophistication of the types of statistical models and other computational models that we're able to use right now. And again, that's sort of gone hand in hand with just, again, the quantity of data that we're collecting, not just on the brain, but, really nice methods that involve something called ecological momentary assessment, where you ping somebody multiple points during the day on their phone and they give you answers. So you're getting this kind of continuous sort of time series of data from somebody that, requires quite sophisticated analytic tools to really unpack what might be happening in someone's life. So I think that hand in hand with the sort of innovative ways of collecting data, I think is really transforming just what we're able to do across both the sort of clinical psychology area where I'm more focused, but also in other areas of psychology.
When you talk about the imaging techniques, I think probably I'm jumping on that because it's closer to the things I know. I've always been struck when it comes to looking at things like material science and quantum materials and things like that. There's been this huge explosion of ways of looking at them and over the last couple of decades. And some of those are, I think, a little bit, as you described, sort of natural extensions of things that were around 20 years ago, and some of them are completely new. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, it's much harder to image living matter that is actually actively thinking. Mm-hmm. But are there new techniques and new imaging techniques in particular that are on the horizon that you're excited about and we should be sort of keeping our eye on?
Yeah, I think for me, one sort of promising lever here that I think we haven't been able to kind of really pull until the last few years is in trying to get at a more causal explanation for behavior or in my case, psychopathology. And again, I suspect you have a causality problem in cosmology as well, but it could be a particular problem in psychology. And a lot of what we've done has been very descriptive. A group of people with a certain set of symptoms, we characterize something about the way their brain might react under certain situations, and we compare that to some group that doesn't have those symptoms. It's not necessarily telling us about what the neural mechanisms might be that contribute to a disorder, for example. So I think there have been advances in ways to actually ethically and safely bring about in more experimental ways changes to brain in things like TMS or certain sort of protocols that involve combining.
You're going to have to tell us what TMS is.
Transcranial magnetic stimulation. Sorry, thank you for that clarification. Where you are sort of going out of your way to kind of stimulate certain regions of the brain and seeing if that is then correlated with changes in behavior. So again, we have to be cautious here in terms of the ethical and the safety implications of that. But, combining that with pharmacological or treatment, medical treatments as well, I think can get us closer to questions of causality, which I think are very difficult, have traditionally been quite difficult in psychology.
So I was last week in Los Angeles doing our Ben Talk series, which was a lot of fun. We were on the Fox studio a lot, which was
nice,
unusual. And, the purpose of that series, as you know, is that professors introduce their research to a much more general audience. So a few years ago, I know you did this for us. You took part in a Ben Talk on the general topic of the science of well-being. Sorry, I think the science of being social is what it was. And I know you actually presented on the science of being antisocial based on your work studying behaviors like aggression and callousness. So, I'd like to probe into some details of that in a little while. But for now, could you tell us a bit about your work into antisocial behavior and what you think it can teach us?
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, I did 2 events, actually, one in New York and one in San Francisco, and it was really fun getting to chat to our alumni. And even though I was presenting on being antisocial, they were very welcoming to me, so that was fun. So I, picking up what I said earlier, I think, have always been interested in what causes people to harm other people, whether that's through physical aggression, so violence, as well as other types of aggression between individuals. And of course, from a societal perspective, that's an incredibly important question because it's incredibly costly economically, but it's also very harmful to the victims of violence and aggression and crime. So I think one of the sort of major contributions so far of my work has been to really take a sort of lifespan approach and think about what factors really early in life might put a child at risk of developing these kinds of behaviors across the lifespan. And we've focused lots of our work on a subset of early traits that we call callous unemotional traits, which capture things like low empathy, a lack of guilt after doing something wrong or causing harm, a sort of fearlessness that might lead a child to not respond to cues that would otherwise signal don't do that, either because maybe someone is angry or crying because they're hurt, or the threat of punishment isn't just, it's real punishment, or it's a threat of punishment. That is not enough to sort of provoke behavior change in a way that would be sort of typical in socialization. So we've sort of focused in on that subset of behaviors and been able to show that you can identify these by about age 3 in a reliable way that is measurable, and that it does, in fact, across development, predict risk for more severe antisocial behavior across development. And I think core to that is the idea that what we're doing here is not trying to stigmatize kids. We're not trying to label them. What we're doing is trying to find where there is meaningful signal in knowing where to target intervention and to then direct services as needed. And it's one way of doing that. I don't think it's the perfect way of doing it. And I think there are limitations in the languages that we use, but really it's about helping families who are potentially parenting a child with some of these early behavior problems and helping them get the resources that they need. And again, in the grand scheme of things, in the longer term, doing that earlier is going to contribute to a sort of safer and society, as well as saving costs down the line that right now are, really all of the sort of cost here is in incarceration and in adult populations. And so much of that could be saved earlier if we did this more effectively.
So I'm kind of interested in this statement about not trying to label these kids. I remember when you and I first met, which I think is a couple of years ago now, we had this I really thought it was fascinating conversation about labels that do get attached to this kinds of behavior, psychopaths, sociopaths, those kinds of things. And I think when people I won't pretend to understand the technical definition of such things, but I know when people hear those things, I think the first thing they often think is that they are immovable. There are things that are not, they're immutable traits that can't be changed. And so, I hear you saying that here there are, in principle, effective strategies that can be used to prevent these behaviors. Can you give some examples of that?
Yeah, and I think that's a really important question. That is one that I'm definitely grappling with. And I think it comes back to, well, I'll answer your question in two ways. So there's the question of what can be changed and what is something that is more perhaps inherent or inherited at an individual level that shapes from really early in life how they interact with other people, with the environment. And then the idea of under what environmental conditions or inputs from the family are those traits expressed in a positive or adaptive way? And then under what circumstances could those traits ultimately end up being harmful or maladaptive for an individual? So the way that I have come to think about it is, again, perhaps harking back to my own undergraduate experience where I was fortunate enough to train with somebody who was a really leading thinker when it came to the sort of connecting normal individual differences in personality with psychopathology, with symptoms, and sort of thinking of them along the same dimension, which I think is probably a more accepted idea now, but he was really one of the first people to put that idea forward. And so for me, that right now, focusing on that early childhood period, the interventions are really focused on parenting and really focused on the family and teaching parents skills that will help manage difficult child behavior, which, is something that all children show, but also matching the sort of temperament of the child, what they're sort of bringing to the table with what is needed from a behavior management perspective. And there really is good evidence that parenting interventions can have big effects. And so again, I think so much can be done in that space for, again, deflecting children from these more kind of severe risk pathways to antisocial behavior or some of the other outcomes that you mentioned. Yeah.
And when you talk about, studying children, I think I at least naturally think that you're studying the child themselves. But the way you're talking about it now, it seems to hinge at least partially on the individual nature of their relationship and interactions with the parents. So do you, in your studies, how do you observe that? Do you observe their interactions with their parents also?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah. And thanks for picking up on that. I don't even know if I was doing it consciously, but I do really think, especially early in childhood, that we have to think of this kind of dyadic relationship, whether that's a mother and a kid, or whoever the primary caregiver is. That's, I think, such an important unit of study, in addition to obviously thinking about the two separately. And so yes, we do all kinds of things in the lab that involve that focusing on that kind of dyadic interaction. So one thing we are doing right now, actually, we have an ongoing study, is we bring parents and children in. They both wear electrodes that are measuring physiological signals in the body. They're both wearing it, so we're sort of syncing that at the same time. And then they do a series of different behavioral tasks together, some of which are kind of designed to provoke normal difficulties that you might face as a parent. So cleaning up some toys that the child was really excited to play with, and that's a really challenging thing as a parent. And just to see kind of observe how that unfolds in the context of the dyad. So that's one example of something you might do. And again, you can, now going back to your question about, different methods and tools we have, even just 10 years ago, what I would have done is recorded that interaction with a video. I would have coded maybe every sort of 10 seconds, maybe every half a minute, different behaviors that I was seeing based on a kind of rating scale. Now what we're doing is using our video recordings from 3 or 4 different angles, using computer vision tools to code almost, at the second-to-second level, changes in facial affect that we then sync to physiological changes that we can also sync to, all kinds of things. So it's just, to me, it's just like a really exciting moment to be in this field and think about, and again, not just at what is happening with the child and what is happening with the parent, but the degree to which those signals are synchronized or happening together. This idea of synchrony, which I think, again, is really important to understand that dyad.
It's kind of interesting. I mean, in physics and in other physical sciences, I think we are used to the notion that, we prepare the experiment in some pristine state and then try to watch it, and we do that over and over again. Your field strikes me as something where you absolutely have very little control over the initial conditions, and sometimes I think people would worry about that, but listening to you talk about it, sounds like at least what you're doing, the chaos and the randomness might actually be advantageous to getting a realistic interaction between parent and child.
Yeah, I think to a degree, and again, I think that comes back to there needs to be some element of experimental control, and the assumptions that we're making about what we're seeing at the level of what we're measuring, for trying to make claims about that. I think there needs to be some standardization. But you're right. I think my staff are phenomenal because they, what they're managing in these data collection moments are, very wide ranging in terms of what happens. And so, yes, we do our best to bring that element of standardization and experimental control to make sure that we're able to have a rigorous study design, but I think nothing's perfect. Yeah,
I think a lot of people don't appreciate the size and complexity of the team that you have to manage to make something like this work. Yeah. So I'm going to ask you a question that there's absolutely no way I'm the first person to have asked you this question, given what you study, which is, you're a parent, I know this. Are there research insights that have changed how you interact with your own children, and do they thank you for that?
They've been guinea pigs for so many of my studies at this point, and I don't think they thank me for that. They do actually. They love coming to my lab because there are so many toys and prizes, and so no, they're brilliant. They're brilliant guinea pigs. I think in a few different ways. I think, thinking about just being a parent, it is obviously just an incredible joy, but it's also incredibly hard. It's by far and away the hardest thing I've ever had to do. And I think even as a person who studies this, I find it really hard to parent my children, and especially right now my son, who is 4, who seems to have just decided that everything I'm asking him to do, he's just going to say no to. And, I really have to catch myself and remember the sort of core tenets of the types of parenting interventions that I've spent 2 decades writing about. I think that really shows to me that these are skills that we just it's strange to me that we don't sort of prioritize that as much as we could. And, I even remember when my daughter was born, leaving the hospital with her and being told, no, you need to leave now, and thinking, what? You can't let me leave with this small human. Like, you've just checked I've got a car seat, but you haven't. What about all the rest of it? Right. And we don't give people a manual. And I think, what I take from my research is trying to remember the things that I know work. But I also, being a parent has also given me this sort of real empathy that I didn't have, I think, when I was first doing this work about what the challenges are. And I hope that is really now filtering into the types of questions that I ask and the way that I ask them. And I think the other thing that really changed one direction I went in with my work since I came to Penn, and this is quite a personal experience, but I'm happy to share it, which was after my daughter was born, I just had absolutely terrible postpartum depression and anxiety. And I was really, really struggling. And it took me a really long time, like an embarrassingly long time, given I was a psychologist by training, to realize what was happening to me. And I was so fortunate that I was, at that time I was at Michigan, and they were able to then get me connected quite quickly with a therapist and with a psychiatrist. And I was able to recover pretty quickly and bounce back after that with that treatment and with that support. But it really changed my whole perspective on childbirth and what it feels like to be a parent. And I had so many resources available to me. And so that was really a motivating factor behind one area of research that I do now, which is a collaboration with Penn and CHOP called Ignite. And we've been following this cohort of women who were pregnant during the pandemic, and not just following them to understand child development, but really thinking about the dyad and the experiences of mothers and childbirth and all that entails, and how, again, to sort of connect it to the broader question of what I do, how critical those first few years are. And if you provide the support that parents need in that time, that actually really sets up children for adaptive development, which again can offset some of the sort of longer term problems that I might be writing about in a different set of my papers. So that was really, I think, a difficult but very important moment in my career where I think I sort of blended deliberately an experience that I'd had with the type of research that I wanted to do.
So I wanted to take us back a little bit to something you said a few minutes ago about how, 10, 20 years ago, you would be taking data and you would maybe code it every 10 seconds or so and see what happened. Things have changed a lot. And one thing that implies, and this is true, I think, across the sciences right now, and not just the sciences, in fact, is that, many of your studies now use really huge data sets, large data sets. And also, your own work, and you've said some of this already, combines a lot of different ways of thinking about these subjects. So observational work, parent-child interaction measures, imaging, et cetera, et cetera. So, I think some people listening might imagine psychology research as mostly qualitative. I mean, I think sometimes a lot of the splashier results you see in the news are along the qualitative axis. Could you explain how combining these different methods strengthens the conclusions that you reach in your work?
Yeah. I mean, I certainly think qualitative research is one important part of psychology. Almost everything I do is quantitative. So we are, through whatever means, questionnaires or observations, we're deriving quantitative numerical scales to assess whatever the construct is. I think that the premise of your question is interesting in that, yes, I certainly collect many, many different modalities of measurement, whether that's, as you pointed to, neurobiology or watching people encoding their behavior or some of these computer vision tools. And I do think that there can be value in combining things. But I think that where I think about it is there's really value more in asking what method is the right method to assess the construct that I'm interested in. So let me give an example. So one thing that I care about in my lab is children who are willing to break the rules, which, by the way, most children aren't. And in fact, that's quite normative. And in fact, children get very anxious about breaking the rules. And that peaks at around 6 or 7 years old. Whenever I swear now, my daughter gets very upset with me because she knows it's not allowed. And I'm sure that's going to change quite soon when she gets a bit older. But one thing we might do, for example, is we could ask a child, how often do you break the rules, or do you break the rules? Now, if we do that and it's, say, a 4-year-old child, the likelihood is that they say I don't break the rules. And it could be just because I'm asking and I'm a strange lady with a strange accent, or they don't really understand the question, or they don't understand the timescale. So maybe we would think, let's put them in a cool experiment in my lab, and we'll have cameras, and the experiment might involve some kind of manipulation where they might have the chance to cheat or break the rules, and we'll leave them in there and then we'll let them see what they do. And that might be kind of informative, but maybe a large majority of them won't. And so what would we learn from that? Well, maybe if we combine it with physiology, we might see that some of them are just completely dysregulated, being left in the room on their own, and that's why they're not breaking the rules. Maybe some of them break the rules and we don't see any physiological change. Maybe some of them will break the rules and we'll add in our cameras again and we'll get computer vision and it'll tell us that they're smiling while they're doing it. And I could go on and on and on and combine all these things at great cost and time, or I could just ask the parent or the teacher. And so again, I think I am all for doing exciting things, but I'm very conscious to think about what is valid, what is effective in terms of where I should be prioritizing my staff's time or my budget, and what's going to get me the signal that I need, and also what translates to the context that I'm trying to translate this to. And if asking a parent is the best predictor of the thing I care about, that's what I'm going to do. But if I can, to understand something from a different level, I'll use these other methods.
That's a nice way of putting it, I think, actually. When you think about these other methods that you're talking about, increasingly, I think, dealing with these large data sets, people are, and not only there, but people are turning to AI in every field. And I know that that's certainly part of what you think about. So maybe we could talk a little bit about how you've seen AI helping your research efforts, and also, if it applies, what are the limits to the ways in which AI can assist you and other psychology researchers in answering these kinds of questions?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I am worried that I haven't been using it as much as I could be. So I think I think initially, probably like a lot of people, I was very cautious and concerned about how AI was going to impact, particularly, as I also teach at Penn. So thinking about that, and I wasn't thinking about it as a tool that I could be using. So I think perhaps I'm a little bit late to the game here, but certainly I know from my own team that many of my trainees and my staff find it very helpful with scripting and writing codes and for analysis. I think it's really changed that in terms of speeding everything up, which I think has been really useful. And again, I think some of the types of statistical models and the types of questions that we want to be asking are ultimately going to be using really sophisticated kind of AI-driven algorithms that will help us to answer questions about the brain or about combinations of different behavior and different time series of data. And I think one example, to draw back on one of my other answers, is to think about sort of synchrony and being able to identify patterns in data in ways that we can't conceptualize, but I think an algorithm might be able to. So I think it's something I want to be better at using, but I think I've got work to do there.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me a little bit of a conversation I'd had in the past with someone about AI when, as the data sets become more complex and you only have finite time and resources, that AI could in principle mine that data for signals that you might not pick up on.
Yeah.
But I assume at the end of the day, you have to find a way to figure out whether there's a real or just a manifestation of larger data sets. Yeah,
that's an interesting point. And I have shied away from that because I just feel like in psychology, I'm sensitive to this in psychology because I think we sort of are on the back of a reproducibility crisis, and we have worked really hard as a field when it comes to pre-registration and open science practices to really try and limit the publishing of sort of spurious findings that aren't motivated by prior research and theory. And so I could imagine that is definitely a thing you could do. For myself, I still feel like I'd like the humans to be in control of some of the questions we ask. But I could also imagine, depending on the type of question that you're asking, if it is a more exploratory question and it's well motivated in terms of being an exploratory question, then maybe, yes, that's when I would apply those tools. But the idea of asking AI, what question should I ask? I don't know, maybe I'm a dinosaur, but I am not comfortable with that.
I don't think you're a dinosaur at all. I think a lot of the conversations we're having in the School of Arts and Sciences around AI, I think, center around exactly this. There are so many things you could do with it, and no one wants to be left behind. There are a lot of opportunities here, but there are also a lot of concerns, and most of these things, or the most concerning of these things, are where this new technology meets people.
Yeah.
So as a School of Arts and Sciences, we're devoted to really understanding, among other things, how culture and people interact with this new technology. I think it's front and center of what we think.
Yeah,
about.
and I think just to pick up on that, I'm in the clinical psychology area, but I'm not licensed and I'm not seeing clients or anything. But I am sort of curious to see how we move ahead as a field with AI as I don't want to say substitute, but maybe as a sort of intermediate between a person-facing client interaction for psychotherapy versus, these sort of generative AI tools that could do a pretty good job of having a conversation with you, and one that could be therapeutic. And obviously there are lots of concerns about that. I certainly think we have a huge access problem in this country to mental health services, and this is potentially a solution to it. But I think the flip side of that, which I think you were getting at, is also the concern around, fundamentally what it means to be human and have human interactions.
Yes.
And what are we doing to our young people if too much of our society is centered on interactions with a machine? And I think it's something I worry a lot about as a parent as well, restricting that. And I think things will hopefully calm down in the next few years in terms of the speed at which the technology is evolving, so that we can catch up and think about what we are going to value in terms of how we manage that and manage people's well-being and safety around it.
Yeah, no place is it more pressing for us right now is how we deal with our undergraduates and how they encounter this, and that's something we're thinking about nonstop. One advantage of being an undergraduate at a place like Penn, where people like you are working, on the very cutting edge of all this, is that students get exposed to it. And so, as someone who teaches and mentors undergrads, more broadly, what do you think students gain from studying psychology, even if they have no intention of, becoming psychologists themselves?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel so lucky to be at Penn, and undergraduates are a huge part of my lab. And I have taught intro psych, and I also teach a seminar on antisocial behavior, not how to do it, but how it happens. I think, just sort of thinking with my Psych 1 hat on, I really think that psychology really is a subject that I think most people can understand why it's appealing as a subject to study. And that's both an innate strength of psychology, is that we all have intuitions about why we are the way we are, in the way that I have no intuitions about what you study. I have absolutely no idea about cosmology, and I'm not going to try and pretend that I can. And so I think there's this connection between self and subject matter that is very unique to psychology. And so that's exciting because you have the potential to sort of think about things that you may have learned and apply them in your own life. But I think it also, because of the nature of the subject, I think we as a discipline, are also need to prioritize, and I think certainly at Penn we do this, being able to design and evaluate and critique experiments in ways that allow you to separate all of those intuitions that you might have that come with their own set of biases from whatever the question is that you're trying to ask. And, one thing that I think, you mentioned the sort of splashy headlines that make the news. I think, again, that happens a lot with some of the psychology findings. So again, teaching that kind of critical thinking when it comes to this subject matter. I don't think it matters what your major is. I think getting that in a psychology class is really valuable. And then, in terms of my own lab, and I think other labs in the department, again, whether or not you're going to stay in psychology, getting that hands-on experience, I think, can be really life-changing for people. And again, just collecting data, working with staff, working with postdocs or grad students who have taken a particular path. And again, this isn't unique to psychology. I think just having that research experience, I think, is really valuable, and I think something that Penn is so good at prioritizing.
Yeah, I think you're right. Given what happens every time a splashy cosmology headline hits the press, let me tell you, there are a lot of people who think they have intuition about cosmology.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I think our students are very lucky to encounter this kind of research, at the edge that they do. And certainly, as we think about curriculum in arts and sciences, that's sort of front and center of what we're thinking about. How do they engage with these cutting edge ideas? And also, how do they, as you say, learn to check their biases, understand how to think through complex problems in a way that they don't come through the door knowing how to do necessarily. So our students are lucky too, I think, to be in your lab. Well, thank you very much, Becky. This has been a lot of fun. I've learned a lot. I hope that I'm going to bump into you again and again on campus and learn even more things about these topics, as we seem to do every once in a while.
Great. Thank you so much for having me.
Pleasure.
This concludes the third episode of Ampersand, our new Omnia podcast series. Many thanks to Mark Trodden and Rebecca Waller for today's discussion. Be sure to listen to our next episode of Ampersand featuring Dean Trodden in conversation with John McDonald, Professor of Criminology and Director of the Master of Science in Criminology program. The Omnia Podcast is a production of Penn Arts and Sciences. Subscribe to the Omnia Podcast on Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts, to listen to new episodes from Ampersand and all of our podcast series.